The question for this week's guest on Here Comes Pod, Clint Culpepper, was relatively straightforward. If you could turn back time, could you find a way to reflect on the iconic movie and now stage show, Burlesque, and share the experience of putting both together? Thankfully, the answer was yes. Clint had an astounding 28-year career at Sony Pictures, where he co-founded and then ran the specialty Screen Gems label. Franchises like Underworld and Resident Evil, critical favourites like Easy A and The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and horror and action films all sat under the Screen Gems label. But of all the movies that Clint put together at Screen Gems, one stands out as special, an outlier, and that movie was Burlesque. It was a film that challenged expectations about the label's ambitions, that went through a tumultuous production and which disappointed at the box office, yet proved to be an enduring fan favourite in subsequent windows and has now been turned into a smash hit West End musical. Clint takes us through the things he did and the things he said to bring Burlesque to the big screen and the stage, and gives us his unique insight into the worlds of movie making, stage production and creativity. They may say that love doesn't pay the rent and that life is a cabaret, old chum, but in the tradition of Here Comes Pod, I say enjoy and welcome to Burlesque. Hi Clint, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here.
Absolute pleasure to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices going. And with you, my question is, if you could make any Screen Gems movie other than Burlesque, which we're going to talk about, into a musical, which one would you choose and why?
It would be a little movie I made called Easy A. You want me to tell you the reason why? Easy A was basically hyper reality. It was a style that lent itself to a broadness on a musical theater stage. It was about a girl, her dilemma in high school, her good intentions led to something that became ridiculously confusing, harmful, all this stuff. Songs would be written, it would be fun, it would end happily ever after, and I think audiences would be entertained.
I totally agree. I had a couple of thoughts, and Easy A would have been one of them. For me, I also thought of Underworld because it had that Romeo and Juliet like quality, and I thought the opening line could be "Thanks for the memory," but we could
Right,
we can
right.
cover that one another day. The movie Burlesque was released in 2010 by Screen Gems, one label among many within Sony Pictures, and the one that you had run since 1998. What was the genesis of Screen Gems? How did it fit into the Sony Pictures world? And to what extent did the success that it had in those early 2000s given you the platform to greenlight a movie like Burlesque?
I was working in acquisitions for the studio with a guy named Peter Schlessel. And what happened was we started realizing that we didn't have enough product out there to acquire through film festivals and film markets. And all of a sudden, we realized, hey, why don't we get involved in scripts and start being involved in the casting and other big decisions? And the product would come to us, and we wouldn't have to worry about finding a great concept with a bad cast that's not commercial, or having to fight Miramax, who would go in and acquire everything that might be commercial. What happened then after that was, because of the success of the things that we got involved with early on, we started to make more product as the product became less and less available. And then through the 2000s, we got more and more and more successful. And as we did, I guess I started saying that our success was based on our prediction of what audiences wanted to see. And so it wasn't out of ego. It wasn't out of making films that we wanted to see. It was based on product that we thought people would want to see at theaters so that maybe we could make our theatricals more successful, but also we could then increase the number of screens that we went on, which also triggered TV deals more, VHS shipments more. So it was an organic kind of unplanned growth. Through the 2000s, we had, you brought up Underworld, we had Resident Evil, we had different movies that we were lucky and got successful on. And so I began to imagine what else we could tap out there that audiences might want to see, and that there were holes, there were a lack of that product that we could deliver. So that's how it came to be.
And specifically then, what was the genesis of the movie Burlesque?
Okay, I had started a relationship with a guy named Stephen Anton. Stephen's sister had a group called the Pussycat Dolls. He told me one night that we were going to go to Johnny Depp's Viper Room on Sunset, where they were going to perform. I knew basically nothing about them. I stood in line with some moron with a clipboard and a velvet rope that kept everybody out in lines. And we bypassed that because they knew Steve. We went down these stairs to a dark, dark tunnel meandering till we came to this room that was packed. And I mean packed. There was standing room only, except for a few booths around the corners. People were so packed and it was so hot and humid down there that I kept thinking to myself, I can't stay in here too long because I'm a bit claustrophobic. When the group came on, I had never seen anything like it on that scale. It reminded me of something Parisian that you would see that kind of harken back to Can Can. And the girls came out, they were lip syncing. They had these adorable, sexy costumes that they wore. It was full entertainment. The thing that surprised me about it and made me start to think this could be something was that the greatest, the loudest, the most enthusiastic part of that audience were women. So it was driven by a female audience who were catcalling, whistling, and going crazy over this. And I was blown away. I didn't understand it until by the end of it, I realized that it was a woman empowerment thing. And that's when I said to myself, men would like to see this for one reason, women would want to see this for another reason. That kind of takes care of at least two of the four quadrants. And I turned to Steve, and in the roar of people whistling and clapping and catcalls, I said, this is a movie. We have to make this movie.
And it was actually Steve who you turned to write the film.
Yes, it was Steve. And then afterward, I wouldn't let it go. And I kept saying to him, we need to write this script. Steve was at a point where he was thinking, I'm not going to write any more scripts that I don't get paid for. And I kept saying, but if we make this, we'll have something to show them. If we pitch it, we won't be able to sell this. And my job was to sell it to bigger Sony, which is Columbia Pictures, Michael Linton, Amy Pascal. And we went like this maybe for a year or two, and I just couldn't get him to sit down and write Fade In. I had a job, he was a writer. We were living together. I would talk to him about doing this, and we went back and forth and back and forth. And by the way, the person that we saw starring in it was Christina Aguilera, or it's the one that I definitely saw because she did a guest appearance with the Pussycat Dolls, as did Gwen Stefani and Charlize Theron and several other big stars who had dance training, dance background, and could sing. The Pussycat Dolls did lip syncing. These girls came in like Christina and Gwen, and they actually sang songs. And they sang the same songs with their take of it. Christina, of course, with those pipes, brought the house down. One day, fortuitously, I was on the set of a movie, and I can't remember exactly which one it was, but there was a break, and the actors had to go back for a costume change. And I, of course, like I always did, walked to the parking lot and was returning phone calls. My assistant said, Tracy Brennan at CAA called. I said, put me through to Tracy. Tracy got on and said, hey, we just met with Christina Aguilera and her team. She's interested in perhaps doing feature films. I called you first to see if you had anything. Now, why she called me first about Christina Aguilera and musical, I'm not really sure, but she did. And I quickly realized that this might be a sign. So I said, actually, I do. And she said, can I read it? And I said, soon, it's not ready yet. I hung up, called Steve, and I said, okay, I just got a phone call from Christina's team. She wants to do movies. If this is not a sign that we should do this, there does not exist one. And he was a little hesitant. And then I kept saying to him, let's start it. We started with Fade In. We came up with a concept, and it was kind of perfect.
So when you got to the stage where you were ready to pitch the movie, particularly internally, what was the reaction within Big Sony when Screen Gems was pitching a burlesque film?
I had not worked with a what I would call well-established producer in town at that point because well-established producers didn't want to work at Screen Gems. They didn't bring their films to Screen Gems because why would they? They would go to Warner Brothers or Universal or Sony or Paramount. And so Steve and I had a friend that we would see in Palm Springs, we would see in town at restaurants here. We knew quite well. His name was Donald DeLine. And we said he was our probably our closest producer, big producer friend. And we thought, what fun to be the three of us working on this project. And we approached him, and he loved the idea. And he said, I'm in. We went to Amy. Amy and Donald had known each other since college and were good friends. And so it kind of started right there. Amy thought, well, what a great idea. Let's see how far it goes. So she called Christina's manager. We set up a meeting. Christina came in with her ex-husband, then husband. We sent her the script first. She came in and she said, as much as she loved the world, the character was not as proactive as she would want to be because she was a strong female in a man's dominated world. And she didn't want to play a girl who reacted to things coming to her as opposed to someone who created her place in the world. We went back, we did a rewrite, we actually even hired someone to help us. And yeah, and then it got stronger. We sent it to her and she signed on. And from then on, we had a movie.
And part of the process of putting the film together was also to bring in other cast, of which probably the most high profile was Cher. So how did that go down?
Originally, we had all talked about Michelle Pfeiffer because she had sung in a movie called The Baker Boys, I think it was,
Fabulous
where
Bacon.
that famous scene where she was on a piano, she was lying on a piano and singing, and it was the highlight of the movie. And it was one of the most beautiful women in the world singing kind of torch songs, sitting on a black baby grand piano. And we remembered that. So our plan was to go to Michelle. We happened to be with David Geffen on his boat at the time. Maybe it was Larry Ellison's. He co-owned for a while that boat with Larry Ellison until he bought Larry out. We were on our way home, and Steve and I had been working on the script for the 10 days that we were on there. And David knew we were working on a script, and he heard things about it because we would all meet at a breakfast table or a lunch table for lunch or dinner. And someone would say, how is it going? And we would talk about it. David really wasn't paying attention. We finished it the day that we left. We were on the plane returning to LA. We had talked about it being finished, and David said, "Send it to me. I'd like to read it." And of course, we broke into a panic and thought, we don't want David reading this because David is hypercritical, because his standard, David had done Dreamgirls. Okay. So we knew that that's kind of the standard that he would be reading from. I was hesitant, and he said, "Oh, just send me the damn script." So we sent it to him while we were on the plane. And we were just landing, and we sent him the script. Probably within 2 hours after getting home and unpacking and all this stuff, I got a call from David. And he said, "It's me. Who's playing Tess?" And I said, "Michelle Pfeiffer." He said, "No, she's not. I'm sending this to Cher." And I said, "But wait, we don't, we, no, we want Michelle." He said, I will never forget, "Clint, who's smarter, you or me?" And I said, "Is this a trick question?" And he said, "I'm sending it to Cher." And he hung up, just abrupt. And we looked at each other. Who is not a fan of Cher? She just was not someone that we had actually thought of as being gettable. So she was never really in the running as far as we were concerned. Cher got it. She read it, of course. Cher used to have a relationship with David for a couple of years. I think David had also been instrumental in her going through successfully her divorce from Sonny. And she had a great deal, they had maintained their friendship, by the way, and she had a great deal of respect for David. And she still says when she's interviewed that David Geffen is the smartest guy she knows. So Cher's manager called us and said that she would like to take a meeting. So Donald, Steve, and I drove out to Cher's house on a Friday night. We sat with her for 3 hours talking. She was completely skeptical. She was not buying it. And I'll never forget, for 3 hours, it seemed like, and of course it wasn't, but to me, it seemed like she was putting on hand lotion forever. I thought I was going to die and she'd still be putting on hand lotion. That's how nervous I was. At the end of the 3 hours, she said, "Let me think about it." It was 9 o'clock. We got there at 6. She walked us to the door, got in the car. I called Christina. Christina was at the Chateau Marmont with friends drinking. She knew we were meeting with Cher. She adored Cher, so much so that when I talked to Cher about Christina, and they had never met, I said, "You don't understand. This chick would drink your bathwater." And Cher said, "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." So Christina knew we were meeting with Cher. She was waiting for a phone call. She said, "Clint, come immediately to the Chateau Marmont. I'm sitting here with friends drinking. I have to hear every detail." And that began the process. Steve and I, stood outside a dubbing stage where she was doing ADR for another movie, an animated movie that she had done. She came out with her assistant, this wonderful woman named Jen, and she looked up. I'll never forget, she had on these little red glasses. She looked like a complete hipster, that long hair, cool jeans, just, Cher. And she looked up, she stopped, and she said, "What are you two doing here?" And I said, "We're going to kidnap you." I pointed up to where Steve's office was in the next building. I said, "We're going to take you up to that office right there, and we're going to talk you into doing burlesque." And so we went up there. We sat for probably maybe 2.5 hours. I got on my hands and knees in front of her. She was saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're doing this." And I said, "I'm begging you to do this." After a while, she started laughing and she said, "Okay," she said to her assistant, it was her manager, "get him on the phone. He was in Australia." She called and said, "I think I'm going to have to do this film." And I heard her go, "Uh huh, uh huh. I know, I know." Uh-huh. Yeah. And then she said, okay, we'll talk. And she hung up and she said, okay, so what's next? And that began it. So by then we had Christina and we had Cher. And then it started to build up.
So now you've got all the elements together, you get the green light and you start making the movie. I think it's fair to say that people look back on that production as being quite tumultuous.
Yes.
What's your perspective looking back?
Okay. So, and I've had a lot of time to think about this. They say don't work with animals, don't work with children, and don't work with friends or partners, domestic partners. I thought I was safe. I wanted Steve to write it so that he and I would write it together. And I knew I had Donald DeLine to serve as a buffer so that Donald and Steve would be working together. Donald had tons of experience, and I could just be the studio guy. Unfortunately, just before we to start shooting, Donald had signed on to do, I think it was the Green Hornet, and the production got moved up by like 6 months, and it was going to be in New Orleans. He had signed on to that movie first. He left to go do that, leaving no buffer between me and Steve. And what happens when you know each other for that long, it's difficult for somebody to realize that they have different hats on. They are no longer someone who is living with you, they are someone who is working for you. And he had, let's say, difficulty with that hat. I, of course, didn't because I had a commitment to Sony. So I was well aware of the fact that I had hired a writer director and that he was my writer director. He didn't see that. He thought it was we were making together a movie together, and I had opinions and he had opinions, and that perhaps we should split them. But I had a commitment, and so started a really tumultuous and troubled relationship. I would never do it again, ever. My warning to people out there is cliches become cliches because they're said often. And the reason why they're said often is because they're true. So when you hear something that you think is a cliche, those who do not heed history are doomed to repeat it. That would be my explanation. It was the most troubled part of my career, the most troubled set and movie I had ever worked in. Our tumultuous set, as you described it, resulted in bad word of the production all over Hollywood. The press heard about it. They were doing interviews with people trying to find out what was going on. It was all about me trying to control Steve, Steve trying to, shall we say, make the best movie he knew how. It was basically, except for a small independent film, it was basically his first film. And as Stanley Tucci and some other people said to me, we've covered this scene every way to Sunday. Steve, being a first time director and having all the different angles that you would have in dance numbers, he wanted to make sure when he got to the editing room that he had every angle possible, more than he'd ever use. Our scenes went long. The fights about budget, me trying to work for the studio, they just became outrageous. Word went out. I didn't know how to, we had huge fights, huge fights. And they wrote a 6-page article before the movie came out. I believe it was Hollywood Reporter. I'm not sure. But basically, it was excoriating me for being stupid and arrogant, and Steve for getting this great opportunity and basically taking advantage of it was the way it was portrayed. I don't think either one of them were true. I think I had shown bad judgment in not replacing Donald. But as I said, Donald was Amy's really good friend. He had a large production fee in the movie. No one wanted to take his production fee away from him. So his idea was, I have a commitment in New Orleans for this movie that I signed on for long before Burlesque. I will do both. But when you're doing a huge, big movie like that in New Orleans, the time that was he would have maybe flown to another set was cut short. So I was on my own. It became a bit of a nightmare, and the article took place.
So you end up with the finished film,
Yeah,
and again, probably fair to say the box office wasn't quite what you'd expected. Was the film that you'd hoped for, even if the box office didn't quite get to where you wanted it to be?
actually, it was because Stephen and I had grown up watching old Hollywood musicals, and it was kind of an homage to the movies that we'd grown up with. That's the first review we got. It was Hollywood Reporter. It came out the night that we were having dinner with Cher. We read it aloud, or I did, and everyone at the table smiled and said, "Thank God he got it." And I think it might have been Kurt Honeycutt, maybe. I can't remember. But we were felt relatively safe that we had made a movie that critics were going to understand. Well, we were releasing at Thanksgiving. That's when we had been dating as alternative programming for family films. Burlesque looked like a bunch of girls in skimpy outfits, singing songs, and Cher and Christina were both known for being a bit risque. It did not say family entertainment. We opened to a disappointing 13 million. It was a big, dark, shall we say, spot on my otherwise successful career at that point. And I remember Amy Pascal calling me the day after and very sweetly saying, I feel partly responsible for this. And I can remember saying to her, as I always did about people wanting to help out or take blame, I said, Amy, know this for sure. If this had been a huge success, you would have gotten from me no credit whatsoever. Even though you deserved it, I would have made sure that I came out looking like I had done it all by myself. I am then going to tell you, if I would do that with success, you are not allowed to take any blame. I remember her saying, I still feel bad. That's mighty big of you. We will come out on this okay. So that was basically theatrical. It then went around the world and did not fare well because a lot of times the international on certain things, especially things that are domestically driven, the international responds to domestic. How much they spend, what the risk is, how much underwater we are. Many factors go into it. So I would say the theatrical was basically a bust.
Well, it was a good premiere in London. That's all I remember. But
You know what we did? We gave great premiere. It lent itself to it. Burlesque, it said, come out for fun. So our premieres were fantastic. Our box office was also muted internationally. What happened was once there was a stink on a movie, or as some of my friends call it, a stank, once that's on there, it kind of spreads like wildfire. Everyone thinks it was a complete, shall we say, I'm trying to think of a word bad enough. It was a mess. And so people assumed that the movie would be a mess. They also were expecting something along the lines of a Chicago and along the lines of an all that jazz. We never set out to make that. Those would have been, first of all, not what we wanted to make, but they would have been a higher goal to achieve.
the question I would also have for you is when it comes to where you stood in the Hollywood ecosystem, you'd had all this great success, and here came Burlesque. Was that something that you were very conscious of? And did people, in some ways, change their view of you?
Okay, so I had lunch with an agent at William Morris, and he and I had a good relationship, and we lunched often. And after Burlesque, we had lunch at the executive dining room at Sony, and I was kind of licking my wounds. And he turned to me and he said, "Can I be perfectly honest with you? And I don't mean this in a mean way." And it was like hearing a but. And I said, "Please go ahead," because I'm always saying, look, I'm an open book. Talk to me. I don't hear things like that personally. I usually listen to things and try my best to figure out how I screwed up and how to learn from it. And he said the town was kind of happy with the fact the movie didn't perform. It was a sting to me personally. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "For years, you've been the little engine that could. And you were defying all the studios because of your continued and kind of surprising success of a guy that came from home video entertainment who had taken a small brand and made it to where you took on the studio releases. And because of what you did by taking one or two quadrant movies, not aiming for the lights, you had now been arrogant enough to take on something with possibly four quadrants. That was the biggest budget you had ever done, which was 55 million, as I recall. And he said, you hired your boyfriend to write it and direct it, which no one is supposed to do, which showed a certain amount of hubris that based on the success that you had, that you had the right to do that. Not untrue, but kind of in my face what I knew and saying it. So I understood then. I became the little engine that became a little arrogant, full of hubris. And that was something I had to overcome. Ironically, 2 years later, I had my best year at Screen Gems. I mean, I had like three or four huge films for us in a row, films that cost like 20, $25 million that did like 120, like The Vow. And I had Dear John, and I had, Think Like a Man, and I had all these movies that kind of people were saying they overperformed. I didn't think they overperformed. They performed exactly the way I thought they would. Hubris again, but it was ironic to me that I thought I was down and out in 2010, and I was able to moved beyond it, and the town welcomed me back as far as calling me up and congratulating me on my recent releases.
So presumably it might have been tempting to consign Burlesque to the history books, but here we are with Burlesque the musical. So how did Burlesque the musical emerge from Burlesque the feature film?
Okay, because I'd grown up on Hollywood musicals that were made in the 40s and Broadway shows, I'd gone to all of the Broadway shows I could when I first got to LA. I remember saying to myself before we started the movie, this would lend itself to a fantastic Broadway's, we call them, it's kind of become generic, Broadway musical, big musical on Broadway. And so, as Steve and I were writing the script, we would talk about a certain scene and where it would be located. Would it be at her apartment? Would it be at, and I kept saying, no, everything that we can make work on the set of the club, we should do because I knew we would adapt it to a musical one day and it would be easier if most of the storyline took place in the club. So, because of the lack of success of the theatrical, we basically put that idea on a back burner to see how the effect of the film, and what kind of brand it could establish. And what we realized is after the theatrical release, where people didn't see it, the success of the DVD sales started to take off. And now there was this unbelievable beginning of an ancillary market of DVD sales. I became, shall we say, less embarrassed and a little prideful that word of mouth was spreading that people loved the movie. Then there was pay TV, there was free TV before any of the streaming came about. The pay TV did very well, the free TV did very well. And I heard word from TV and home video that this was all beginning to happen. And they were all pleasantly surprised because we had had, after theatrical, a deficit. And I was not used to having deficits. So this was driving me crazy because I was used to delivering so much to the bottom line almost every time I went to bat. Cut to streaming, okay? And streaming cycles, streaming deals. And then I would have people send me things like when Netflix announced that it was in the top 10, okay, for the period. And then it would go to another streamer. And again, it would be in the top 10. And then it would go to another streamer. And again, it would be in the top 10. Well, this did nothing but make me feel good. And by the way, I had given Steve the theatrical rights. When I say theatrical, I mean not theatrical, I mean the theater rights, the live show theater rights, which I don't think people did. But I gave it to him because he got scale. And I kind of knew that if I gave it to him, that I would then be able to push those rights to get him to Broadway. And it would be something he and I would be able to work on, and I could see my dream come true. So we stood back for a while, looked at it, and said, let's go back to the movie. Let's make the two characters, the young girl and the older woman who ran the club. We changed it because we felt like the mama I want to, sing, I've got a big voice, the whole thing had people didn't understand it and it felt old and antiquated and not an homage. So we added the device of the test character had had a baby at an early age, gave up the baby because she had to. She was too young. She had too many plans, and that she would probably ruin her life as well as the baby's. And then we had the young girl finding out that she had been adopted, going and seeking to meet the mother, find out what had happened, why she was put up for adoption. She didn't know until her mother died that she was. And she went to New York on this journey to discover who her mother was and her past. She also happened to have a voice. And so began the relationship of a young woman and an older woman who ran a club and what would be.
How did you put the London cast together? Because I've seen it and they're absolutely fabulous.
We went to previews in Manchester. To say that I was not satisfied with the show was an understatement. We did learn a lot. We had a guy, very talented, fantastic dancer, good choreographer, and every scene that he was in, the show came to life. I mean, it just came to life because he's electric. And I kept saying, as did Steve to the other producers, what is the favorite part of the previews? They hesitated, and we said Todrick. Every number that Todrick's in, the play in Manchester lit up. Wouldn't you like the entire show to be that? It took forever, especially two producers from, let's put it, two producers who fought us tooth and nail. No, 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 no. We were able to, with the other two producers, talk them into it. And now we had Todrick as director. And then there was an actress that Todrick knew who had been nominated for a Tony in New York. And coincidentally, she was Cher's godchild. Okay. And so then we had Todrick, and now we had a new Tess. So we were ready to go. We liked Jess Foley, Jess Foley came aboard strangely enough because she wrote a couple of songs. and we heard her voice when she did the demos. And Steve said to her, "Have you done musical theater?" And I think she had not, or if she had, not that much. And he said, "What if we asked you to come in and play Allie?" I think she was thrilled. Her voice was fantastic. She had won, I think, in England, I think she won maybe the kids, the younger voice, or Britain's Got Talent, and then she maybe came in second or third on Britain's Got Talent. I don't know. I don't know how it was, but she was definitely a certified and recognized talent in the West End or in UK. And she was hired because of that. Todrick was brought in to play Sean because Todrick had written Big. And Big was probably right now, the big show tune that if he were to perform it on any, shall we say, award show, that would be the show he does because I think that's the one that gets the longest standing ovation. So now we had to figure out where our home was going to be. We thought, okay, people are telling us we'd be lucky to get a West End theater after our previews within a year. We thought, oh gosh, this is it's like planes on a runway waiting for someone in the control tower to say, okay, you're up now. It was very congested, and we were quite dejected, right? And out of nowhere, as luck would have it, we got a call from the guys at ATG who ran the Savoy that said they were interested in talking about it, looking at our costs and what we could do, how quickly we could put it together. Because I think maybe it'd only been maybe 3 months since our previews. We were probably among three, I was told. I had cut a version of Todrick doing the opening number of the musical in Manchester. We sent it to them. I don't think they had really seen or remembered that. Maybe they had a scout. I'm not sure of the details. What I do know is the next day they called and they said, okay, you are now in first place. This would be the starting date. It would be a 9-week run. Can you do it? And of course, like you always do, you say, of course, we can do it, right? And then you get off the phone and you start to scramble. And so now we had a new director, we had a new production designer, we had a new star playing Tess, and we had to quickly get the sets designed and get Todrick to redo all the choreography. And he must have written, I think, over 20, 25 new songs for it. And you've heard him. He's very talented. And he and Steve worked together to figure out how the story should be told. Should it be in dialogue here? Should it be in music there? And it just organically grew into the show that I think you saw. We made our deadline just barely, but I've been told that's the way it is because you wind up sometimes going on and not having rehearsed or quickly tacked the last 3 or 4 songs. So our costumes were not complete. Our sets were not finished. We had a start date. We went on. We explained to the audience that we were a work in progress, that I'm not sure how often that happens. So then we went on sale, and word of mouth through the 10 days previews was so good that, and we put scenes from it and stuff on social media, which went viral. People saw it, and the ticket sales began to just snowball. And what we wound up doing was, I think our capacity at the end of the run was 99 point something percent of filled seats, which is kind of not done that often. And almost every show for the 9 weeks was completely sold out, which was completely gratifying, completely gratifying. And we finished a hit. So for me, having this idea one night in the Viper Room and having the defeat, licking my wounds after the theatrical at Sony, And knowing that I had even talked to Cher and Christina and said, when this goes to Broadway, will you do the first 6 months? And Cher looked like I had three heads. And she said, what? And I said, Christina has committed. Will you do the same? And she said, Christina's going to do it. Yes. And then I went to Christina and I said, Cher's committed to the first 6 months. She says, if you do it, she'll do it. And I think Christina said, fine. Well, by the way, that idea fell apart because of the lack of success on the theatrical. So it took 15 years to make this happen, which sometimes is not that uncommon. We now have a huge success on our hands, and all we have to do is take it and guard it, be smart about it, and we hope that many, 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 many people for years to come will see the show and get the enjoyment out of it that we got out of making it.
Well, that is a fantastic end to a story. It's been an incredible journey.
I'm glad you got to see it, and I'm glad you went from the movie and the after party to the play and the after party because I think that's why you came up with the idea. You thought to yourself, as you said to me when we talked about doing this, why 15 years? How did it come to be? And you basically said, soup to nuts, I want to know. And I think other people might. So to me, that's the story. It was fraught with, lack of success. And I think as a lot of things do, it found its place. And I'm very thrilled, as is everyone else associated with it.
Fantastic. Well, I'm secretly quite a big fan of musicals, and I think it absolutely stands up. And I've been delighted to be on that this part of the journey with you as well. So, Clint, thank you so much for being a guest on Here
It's
Comes
been my
Paul.
pleasure. We're talking about one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah,
If it
absolutely. Yeah.
hadn't been successful, trust me, I would speak to no one about it. But now I am shouting it from the highest hill. I was right. I was right. And trust me, I was wrong. So it's good to kind of turn it around.
Yeah. And shouting things from mountains is very musical. It's very Sound of Music, for example.
It really is.
So it's again a very fitting way to finish. So thank you so much
Yeah.
for being a guest.
Hey, thanks so much for being interested. I appreciate it.